Welcome to War on Air, a Judging Jesus edition. Today's video is a response to an old friend of mine on the topic of how to value the hypothetical claim of canonical gospel Jesus that few would be saved from his eternal wrath. In case you didn't know, Jesus intended to return with an army of angels to eternally torture the vast majority of humanity for the crime of being imperfect. Check out my previous videos to see my case laying that out if you don't believe me. I've known Bruce the monk since back in the day when I was a Christian. We went to the same Lutheran church in Ohio together. He's a smart, caring guy, and I'm glad he took the time out to respond to one of my videos. He basically did an hour-long reaction video to my Few Will Be Saved video. In that previous Judging Jesus video, I laid out my case that when canonical gospel Jesus taught in Matthew 7:14 that few would be saved, he meant very few would be saved. Canonical gospel Jesus overtly has the exact opposite expectations of most modern Christians, who seem to be under the impression that most people are basically good and will be saved, and that only a handful of the worst people who ever lived will be stuck in hell for all eternity. Check out that video to see my full case. Now, Bruce the monk and I are basically on the same page as far as what I would call reading comprehension Jesus on this particular issue. That is, the views of Jesus found as is as a literary character in his own light in terms of just the canonical Gospels. What we disagree about is how to value the few will be saved claim, at least in hypothetical terms. Since I believe that Jesus was threatening his apocalypse in the first century, and Bruce believes it is still yet to come. But is the idea in and of itself evil? Is there anything morally wrong, or at least highly questionable, about the idea of a God judging humanity so profoundly harshly? Does any of this reflect back on the hypothetical moral character of this God? I say yes, and Bruce the monk says no. So let's explore that. Most other Christians I talk to basically can't accept that it is entirely accurate to portray canonical gospel Jesus as intending to return with an army of angels to eternally torture the vast majority of humanity for the crime of being imperfect. So it's nice at least when we can get to the easy facts. It's nice at least when we can get the easy facts of what Jesus says straight before discussing how to value them. Bruce the monk basically bites the bullet and agrees with my reading of Jesus. He then turns to say that this is all okay because everyone really is evil. We deserve it, and there's a way out, so what's the problem? But are we all evil? Evil here is being defined as imperfect. And supposedly, an absolutely holy God just can't stand even the slightest moral imperfection and simply has to infinitely punish the slightest blemish because of justice with a capital J. And sure, if Jews really are inferior, then why not the Holocaust? And if black people really are worth 3/5 of a white person, then why not slavery? So if all humanity really is evil, then why not set them all on fire for all eternity? It would be wrong not to. The claim as given may be logically valid, but is it sound? Are Jews or black people inferior to white people? Is all of humanity evil? Now, in my world, I could understand if super beings of many different scales, that is, aliens who actually are mentally superior to us humans in a majority of ways, just didn't have the time for humanity. I could even see them being fairly disgusted or disappointed in us in general. Despite us being on a solid trend towards being less violent and more peaceful, as Steven Pinker points out in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, we're still not all singing Kumbaya down here all the time. If an alien turned up their nose holes after getting a good look at us collectively and said, moving on to the next solar system, okay, I get it. Few complaints there. Slightly advanced monkey brains, not necessarily that impressive. But thinking that we're worthy of being set on fire for an infinite amount of time, well, that's just capricious and unnecessary. I've argued in a previous video that despite Jesus declaring that there are eternal sins, that finite human beings can't possibly be legitimately tried in any just court as infinite beings, any more than we would try children for the crimes as adults. Children don't fully realize the implications of their behavior, and so we're justifiably more lenient. Humans know of the infinite, kind of like Bart Simpson in that one episode when asked if he knew his multiplication tables, replied, I know of them. We can barely do basic math in our heads. We know there's a such thing as $1 million, but we can't possibly imagine all the serial numbers of each bill at one time. As finite beings, we can't literally contemplate the infinite. We may know of the basic idea, but only an infinite being with literal infinite conceptions of things would be able to be held that accountable for their actions. Infinite punishments for finite crimes is illegitimate. Moses declared an eye for an eye, but Jesus would have us believe in an infinite number of eyes for an eye. These are grossly inconsistent standards. It doesn't make a lot of sense to blame humanity for their imperfection. The Christian God just looks like a maniac who needs to take his meds. So there's that issue. Here's another. Inconsistency in your applied moral reasoning, potentially. Was Hitler only a slight percentage wrong because he might have accidentally killed a handful of good Jews? Most of the Jews he would have killed would, by yours and Jesus' definition, deserved it. So do you just have a slight nitpick with the Holocaust? How do you know Jesus didn't want it to happen and Hitler was just following divine orders? Not like the Bible God never dished out any justice in this life. Similarly, are comic book supervillains who want to destroy humanity just wrong because it's Jesus' job to destroy humanity? How do you enjoy movies and comic books, Bruce? Do you have one set of values for enjoying life and another for being a Christian? It kind of sounds like it. Should we make more oppressive laws and have horrendous punishments for any trivial violation because apparently we could hardly go wrong? There's just no such thing as cruel and unusual punishment or punishments fitting the crimes, just empty concepts since we all apparently deserve infinite punishment all the time. Similarly, in terms of inconsistency, I don't think my friend Bruce the monk is really emotionally processing the Grimm's fairy tale he says he believes in. I don't see how he or anyone else really can. Are you actually infinitely horrified by any slight imperfection in your behavior, Bruce? Does your brain just explode when you break a nail? I don't see how that's psychologically possible. You pass out every moment of the rest of your life from moral overload to actually, literally, emotionally process this Christian theology. You'd go insane if you actually even generally tried to experience your own belief system without just skipping all the evil parts and getting to the part where you're supposed to forgive yourself and see the best in people. It's not plausible psychology. You mentioned that you love talking to prison inmates because they readily accept what horrible people they are. However, I must point out that this is rather selective evidence. If I went to the other end of the spectrum, to the percentage of humanity who were born in a culture predisposed to maximal human good, we'd get a different perspective. Statistically speaking, they exist, even if you'd still be inclined to dock them all moral credit to the infinite degree for not considerately offering someone chewing gum that one time. Here's how I see it, and I say this respectfully merely to be perfectly honest and straightforward with what I think about the applied issues. I take it you probably appreciate that despite continuing to disagree. In theory, Bruce the monk, like many Christians, has an evil belief system, again, in theory. You're basically a spiritual Nazi. And that's not an exaggeration. Hitler, had he successfully conquered the world as intended, would probably have been more happy with more people he deemed worthy of his Aryan race than your Jesus deems worthy to be saved. However, in practice, given you've been commanded to ignore all of that, again, in practice, you're still largely a good person. That's what's so bizarre about this. You're obviously a good, caring person, Bruce, but you have these absolutely atrocious moral beliefs. And it's the opposite for the character Jesus. In theory, Jesus is supposed to be a good person. In practice, he's worse than every 20th century genocidal dictator combined. And that was my point about saying Jesus was just fine with rescuing one sheep out of 100. I completely agree with you, Bruce, that Jesus' parable of the lost sheep presupposes the other 99 sheep didn't need saving. It's basic reading comprehension. I get it. He's selling his credentials as a good shepherd. I'm not like any of those crappy shepherds who are just fine with going home with 99 sheep out of 100. I'll go out of my way for even that one lost sheep. 100% agreement, that's what Jesus intends to convey. I never thought otherwise, never argued otherwise. But that's in theory Jesus, by his own assessment. In practice, Jesus, again, by his own assessment, by mine and yours incidentally, is a Jesus who practically is morally satisfied with returning with the proverbial 1 out of 100 sheep. Get it? It's hypocrisy, Bruce. It's a shepherd that brags about his credentials and then when it actually comes down to it, makes up excuses for his abysmal failure. These fucking sheep, man, would you believe them? Didn't want to be shepherded. That kind of shepherd gets fired. When it's Jesus, he gets worshipped. So that's kind of a discrepancy. Jesus lambasted the supposed hypocrisies of the Pharisees, scribes, and teachers of the law along the same lines, what they preached versus what they did, or in this case, what Jesus intended to do, and what he even admitted was going to be the inevitable outcome. So I know you think hypocrisy is a valid moral line of criticism, in theory versus in practice. It's pretty basic. Everyone understands that kind of thing. Hopefully you understand what I meant now. I'm not misrepresenting the parable of the lost sheep. I'm using it as an ironic case in point, or counterpoint to, as Jesus in theory, to compare it to Jesus in practice, and then putting Jesus in practice back in terms of the parable to show the glaring difference. Hopefully that clears up the confusion, and I look forward to your response if you have the time.